Matthew chapter 26, please. In this class, we're nearing the end of the Gospel of Matthew. And Lord willing, following Matthew, the plan is to study the letter to the Romans. The letter to the Romans. And so look forward to studying that letter with you in this class. Matthew 26. About verse 26 there, please. The last Passover, Jesus observed. He took two elements on the Passover table, and he gave them new spiritual significance in his kingdom to come. Matthew 26, verse 26. While they were eating, Jesus took bread. After blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. God knows more than anyone our tendency to forget things, even things we thought we would never forget. We forget. Important events, people important to us, we sometimes forget. And because of this, and because what Jesus is about to do is the most important event in the history of mankind, his suffering for us, his mental anguish for us, his death for us, this is something that must never be forgotten. And so to remember this, to preserve the memory of the most important event in the history of man, God didn't have his son's face carved in the side of a mountain. He didn't even set up a tombstone in a graveyard somewhere, but a simple memorial supper consisting of unleavened bread and fruit of the vine. Bread representing the suffering body, the anguish of his mind as he went through these things, and the fruit of the vine representing his precious blood shed for us and which saves us from our sins. And so we have the Lord's Supper. Verse 28, he said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is shed on behalf of many for the forgiveness of sins." God has always defined his relationship with man in terms of covenant. Now, going back in the history of the Old Testament to the very beginning, who did God have a covenant with that affirms what I'm teaching? Who did God have a covenant with? Adam. Had a covenant with Adam. It was a unilateral, as all God's covenants are, unilateral, not bilateral. They're unilateral. God sets up the covenant. If there are terms and conditions, who determines all the terms and conditions? God. And man neither accepts or rejects, but if he rejects, there are serious consequences. But God had a covenant with Adam. God had a covenant with who else in the Old Testament? Notable. Abraham had a covenant with Abraham. Noah had a covenant with Noah. The bow covenant, the covenant of the bow, which is with all mankind as well. And with Moses, with the children of Israel in Exodus chapter 19. Let's go back to that covenant, Exodus 24 actually, and look at some of the details of that covenant in Exodus 24. God has always defined his relationship with man in terms of covenant. In Exodus 24. Verse 3. Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord, all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice, and they said, all the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do. And so there's an agreement to the terms, conditions that are set by the Lord. And then verse 4, Moses wrote down all the words. And now the written word is as authoritative as the spoken word. So he writes down all the words. And in verse 5, he sent young men of the sons of Israel. They offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls, peace offerings to the Lord. Moses took half the blood, put it in the basins, the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. He took the book of the covenant, and now he read it. So he spoke it, wrote it down, and he read it. And what he's reading, written down, is as authoritative as what he just said. And what is written, though, represents God's part in the covenant. Just as the Ten Commandments in the Ark of the Covenant represented God's part in that covenant. So these written words here represent God's part in the covenant. So verse 7, he took the book of the covenant, read it, in the hearing of the people. They said, all the Lord has spoken, we will do, we will be obedient. That's the third time they've agreed to the covenant. In verse 8, so Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, the book, and the altar. And then he said, in verse 8, behold the blood of the covenant. Now, when Jesus says in Matthew 26:28, this is my blood of the covenant, we need to understand that connects with what Moses said here. This is a covenant, and when a covenant is made, you have a sacrifice, and the blood of that sacrifice is associated with the people involved in the covenant. And so it's sprinkled on the people, on the book itself, and the altar. There's an association there in this blood. So when Jesus says this is my blood of the covenant, whose blood is he talking about? His own blood. So Jesus is the one presenting the covenant, and Jesus is the sacrifice in the covenant. And then when we get to Matthew 26 and 29, what's Jesus doing with us in the covenant? What's he doing with us? He's partaking with us in the kingdom. He's partaking with us in the kingdom. And so he's the sacrifice. He's the one who's giving the covenant, and he partakes with us in the covenant. That's Matthew 26 and 29. Now, back still in Exodus 24, verse 9, Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. They saw God of Israel under his feet, a pavement of sapphire as clear as the sky itself. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel. They saw God, they ate, and they drank. So Moses makes it clear God wasn't there to punish them. God was there to commune with them. And we've studied, I think one of my first lessons in the first, 3-6 months I was here was on covenant, because that's how important covenant is. We have a covenant with Adam, between Adam and God, and then we have marriage in Genesis 2, which is covenant. It's covenant. Malachi 2, verse 14 through 16. So covenant is extremely important. And here it is again, and Jesus says, if you are in my kingdom, then you are in covenant relationship with me. And so it's very, very important that we see that, but also we see that when a covenant was made, people would typically pass between the parts of an animal, and then they would take a portion of that sacrifice and they would eat together. That's covenant in ancient times. And so they would pass between the parts of the animal, and then they would take a portion of it, and they would eat a portion of that animal. And what would that denote in ancient times? If you ate a portion of the sacrifice, what would that denote? Agreement. We are in fellowship. We are in agreement. We're in harmony. So when you observe the Lord's Supper, which is a covenant meal, the Lord's Supper is a covenant memorial meal, then you're saying we are in fellowship. We are in agreement here. We are unified with the Lord and with one another. It's a sharing in the body of Christ. 1 Corinthians 10. It's a sharing in the blood of Christ. We don't practice closed communion. So if somebody comes in on the street and they say, I want to partake of that too, we're not going to stop them from doing that. But we understand the Bible teaches that the Lord only has fellowship with those who are truly in his kingdom. It is a covenant meal between the Lord and his people. Okay, we've said that, we've brought that out a number of times, and because it's so important. We can see why the bread, fruit of the vine, representing his body and his blood. It's not literal flesh, literal blood, as some churches teach, but it's representative. But we can see why Jesus did this, because that's the way a covenant is done. A portion of the sacrifice is partaken of. Jesus is the sacrifice. He is a covenant maker, and he is the sacrifice. And he communes with us when we observe it. Anyone have comment or questions on this? Anyone? Yeah.
I found it interesting when studying in Hebrews how much the epistle of Hebrews refers back to these elements, to Exodus 24 and passages like that.
Yeah.
To emphasize the covenant, to emphasize how Jesus is fulfilling his covenant, how it stands different from the covenant of Moses. But so much of it is connected to this.
Yeah, absolutely, because of the importance of covenant. Again, marriage is a covenant. And very, very important that we keep that covenant. It's a bilateral covenant. We're talking about a unilateral covenant. Typically, you've got mutual parties, equal standing, an agreement is reached between them. But in this case, it's God determining, again, all the conditions, terms, if there are conditions and terms. There aren't always, such as the rainbow. But if there are, God sets them all. And we either accept or reject. But if we reject, there are serious consequences. But it is covenant. A lot on that. When our brother was here in the meeting, he brought that out quite a bit as well recently. Okay, let's move on a little further here if we may. Let's go back to Matthew 26, please. So hold your place in Matthew 26, and if you would turn to Acts 2:42. Acts 2:42. So I need a reader. Acts 2, verse 41 and 42, please. Just anyone, just go ahead and read that. Acts 2, 41 and 42, loudly enough so we can all hear, please.
So those who welcomed his message were baptized, and that day about 3,000 persons were added. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayer.
The people receiving the word, and when we receive the word, we will be baptized. And Luke wants us to see some of the ways that receiving the word and now being baptized impacted their lives. And he mentions 4 things they were continually devoted to. What are those 4 spiritual things? In order. So now it's the apostles' teaching, fellowship. Okay. Breaking of bread, which I'm convinced is the Lord's Supper, not a common meal. And what's the fourth activity here? Prayer. So no question we have spiritual Bible teaching from the apostles, fellowship, spiritual, prayer, spiritual. If you've got an apple tree, you're not going to suddenly see an orange. So you've got three spiritual activities. I'm convinced that that is a spiritual activity. Being baptized did not change the fact that they ate meals. But it did change the fact that they were continually devoted now to this, something Jesus had commanded. And that is, remember me in this way, as well as when you go through the week. And so a continual devotion. Now, the fact that they were doing that, they were continually devoted to the breaking of bread. Again, that makes no sense to say now, after being baptized, they were continually devoted to eating. Think about it. Again, it's from context, I'm convinced it is the Lord's Supper. And 1 Corinthians 10 also shows us that this is not the only place where the Lord's Supper is referred to as breaking of bread. It is not the bread which we break, a sharing in the body of Christ. 1 Corinthians 10, no question that's the Lord's Supper. It's not the cup we drink, a sharing in the blood of Christ. So they're partaking of it. Now, what did Jesus say and promise in Matthew 26:29? What did he promise in Matthew 26:29? If you go back to that passage and look, what did he say he would do? So he would eat and drink of this anew in the kingdom. Well, here they are partaking of it. So what does that tell you about the kingdom? It had begun. It had begun. So the kingdom clearly was established there on the first Pentecost after the Passover. Jesus observed, and the kingdom had begun. Okay, other comments on this? Questions? Let's go from this continual observance. They were continually devoted to by the way, what are some other translations? New American Standard says continually devoted. What are some other wordings there? Continued steadfastly. So it's something that was consistently done. Can you continue steadfastly in or be continually devoted to the apostles' teaching and do it any less than once a week? Can you be continually devoted to fellowship and do it any less than once a week? Can you be continually devoted to prayer and do it any less than once a week? I suggest the same thing is true of the Lord's Supper. Can we be continually devoted to that and do it any less than once a week, especially since Jesus commanded us to do it? So some thoughts along this line, also building the idea of how often. How often did they observe? What sayest thou? How often did they observe? Okay, that's right, sister. First day of the week, and what passage teaches that, and for what purpose did they come together? Acts 20. Okay, and go ahead, brother, and read Acts 20, verse 7, if you would, loud and clear, please. the only passage where the day of observance is revealed. All right, you have that?
Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them. Continued his message until midnight.
Okay, so Paul's coming, being with them, dialoguing with them, which is the Greek word. It was not a sermon format as we're used to. It was a dialogue. He spoke, they answered or asked questions. It was back and forth. That's what it was. But that was secondary to their primary purpose for coming together. We came together to break bread on the first day of the week. And so what does that say to us then about frequency? Just that statement alone, what does it say about frequency? Sorry? Okay. Okay. And so when Luke records that upon the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, does he elevate, does he emphasize one first day or another over another? Does he demote and put into a lower level one day below another? How does he treat the first day there? He treats them all equally. Much like when God said to Israel in Exodus 20, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Every week has a Sabbath. And the Jews understood, well, since God simply said the Sabbath, he doesn't elevate one above another. He expects us to treat them all the same. And so they observed the Sabbath Saturday, a day of worship, rest, every single Saturday. It was not just a day of rest, by the way. It was a day to remember their deliverance from Egyptian slavery. But they understood, even though God didn't say every, that was the idea, because every week has one. For example, here we meet right now, we're searching, when should we observe the Lord's Supper? Jesus commanded it. They were continually devoted to it. What passage are we going to end up at? To say when? Acts 20, verse 7. Okay, Monday comes, and we're going to ask the same question. Now, when do we observe the Lord's Supper? Again, where are you going to end up? Right back at Acts chapter 20, verse 7. It's going to be, and the next Monday, the same thing. You're going to, because it's stated in a way in which God intended all of them to be treated the same. And so, just as they were continually devoted to it, we do it once a week. Okay, any comments or questions on that? Anyone? Anyone? That's all clear enough. That's one a lot of people have questions about. Where did they observe it? So when, the frequency, I think hopefully we can see that each Lord's Day. But what about where? Where was it observed? Acts 20, what do we have in verse 7? A congregation there in Troas, right? Paul tarried in verse, Charlie, you still have that passage open? Read verse 6, please.
We sailed away to Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. And in 5 days, joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days.
Why do you think he's tarrying 7 days? What does he know is going to happen? They're going to be observing the Lord's Supper. He's tarrying because he knows they're going to be observing the Lord's Supper. Notice it's after the days of unleavened bread, by the way. You see that? They observed it after the days of unleavened bread. There's at least one group that says this should be observed annually, and that's at the time of the Passover. But even when we have a record of them doing it at a particular time or day, it's after the Passover. It's after the days of unleavened bread. So they observed it after the Passover. But you see a congregation, Paul tarries. He doesn't just take it off in a corner somewhere and observe it. He tarries. He knows they're going to be meeting to observe it. He meets with those saints and he observes the Lord's Supper with those saints. In other words, in an assembly of saints, such as this. Yes, sir.
It's interesting, Luke doesn't record just extraneous information, it doesn't mean anything. He tells us that Paul waited there for 7 days, that he could assemble with him. Later in verse 16, he tells us that Paul was in a hurry. But it was so important for him to meet with these saints to observe the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
And even though he was in a hurry, he still was going to wait.
Yeah.
I think that's a good lesson for us.
Yeah.
That our plans need to be revolving around what's most important to God.
Yeah. Good. That's very good in context, how important, again, it was to him. Okay, good. Anybody else? So we see an assembly in Acts 20, and in Acts 2:42, what do we have there? Fellowship, breaking of bread. Again, Christians doing this together. What about 1 Corinthians 11? What do you see in 1 Corinthians 11, a passage often used in presenting, talking about the Lord's Supper? Where are they when they observe it in 1 Corinthians 11? In an assembly. In an assembly. 2 times it'll say when you're assembled. So it's an assembly of Christians. It's an individual act between you and God done in an assembly of saints. At least that's every example that I see. And God searches the hearts. Okay. Anything more on that before we move on to the next section here? Verse 30. Let's go back to Matthew 26 here. Matthew 26, verse 30. After singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Matthew doesn't tell us what hymn, but wouldn't you love to hear Jesus singing a hymn? A hymn is a praise song to God. Orthodox Jews tell us that after the Passover, the Jews would traditionally sing Psalms 114 through 118. I think you can see why. Go back to Psalm 114. That makes a lot of sense when you see the teaching there. Psalm 114. Psalm 114, verse 1. When Israel went forth from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, the Red Sea. The Jordan turned back. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. Remember the mountains shaking at Sinai. What ails you, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains, that you skip like rams? O hills like lambs? Tremble, O earth, before Jehovah, before the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a fountain of water, who fed them from a rock. And Jesus, 1 Corinthians 10, was that rock. So you can see why, just reading one of those Psalms, this would be very relevant, very appropriate to sing after or during the Passover. The Jews say Psalm 114 through Psalm 118. Well, back in Matthew 26, on the way to the Mount of Olives, Jesus cites a prophet the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah, as we've divided the book in chapter 13 and verse 7, he prophesied, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. That's in Matthew 26, verse 31, quoting Zechariah chapter 13. And so Zechariah prophesied that the shepherd, the anointed of God, would be stricken and that the sheep would scatter. Who's the shepherd? Who's the sheep? We're talking about here. Who's the shepherd? Jesus, and the sheep are the disciples. And so they are going to flee. They're going to desert Jesus. Judas will betray him. The other 11 will desert him. Jesus, again, is preparing them. He's thinking about them entirely. 100%. He's thinking about them and glorifying the Father. And he's trying to prepare them and say, look, the trials that are about to come upon me will create many trials for you as well. And so you need to be prepared for these trials. I want you to notice before we leave this also, verse 31, in quoting Zechariah, it says, I will strike down the shepherd. Who's I? That's God. All of this is going according to God's plan. This is not something happening randomly or in the control of the scribes and the rulers. This is God's plan. God is using their very bad, evil decisions to accomplish his own purpose. And that will be brought out. In fact, let's go ahead. Someone turn to Acts 3, 17 and 18. This is all according to God's plan. And God is in control. Acts 3, verse 17 and 18. Someone read that? Anyone? Just go ahead and take off if you would. Acts 3, 17 and 18.
Now, brethren, I know that you act in ignorance, who did also. But thanks to God announced beforehand by the mouths of all the prophets that Christ would suffer. He has thus fulfilled.
God has thus fulfilled. I know you acted in ignorance. You made bad choices, sinful choices. But God used those choices, the situation, to accomplish his own purpose, an eternal plan to save mankind through his son, Jesus. And so it's all going according to plan. Go back with me, Matthew 26 now. And Jesus says to them in verse 32, so they're going to strike down the shepherd, the sheep are going to scatter. But look at this very confident trust in God's plan. After I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. So I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die because I am the Christ, the anointed of God. And that's the plan of God, that I die on your behalf. But I'm going to be raised. And he's telling them ahead of time, I'm going to meet you in Galilee. Now, after he is raised, an angel of the Lord will remind them he's in Galilee. He's going to meet you in Galilee. And that's why in John 21, that's where they are, in Galilee. And Peter decides to use the occasion to go fishing, but they're there because Jesus said that he would meet them there. But you look at other prophecies like Psalm 16. Look at Psalm 16. And look how confident the Lord is in Psalm 16 about this. Though he must die, in Psalm 16, verse 10, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, the realm of the dead, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. You will preserve my body, and my spirit will enter into that body once again. I know this is going to happen. You will not leave me in Sheol. And I'll just reference this, if I may, class. When Jesus was on the cross and about to die, he said, into thy hands I commit my spirit. Knowing he could fully trust his spirit in the hands of the Father. That the Father would preserve the body, and he would, on the third day, bring that spirit out of Sheol, reunite it with that body, and in that body, Jesus would appear for 40 days as a witness that he truly was raised. He was the first fruits, guaranteeing our own resurrection. That's the first fruits we're going to follow. And so we can entrust our soul to God as well. I know whom I have committed my soul to, right? We sing that song. It's a great song because it's basically saying, I know whom I have believed and am persuaded he is able. He is able. And Paul was saying the same thing. Jesus was saying the same thing. I commit my spirit to you, knowing that you will take care of it. And God would raise him up. Okay, and so let's continue a little further. Verse 33 of Matthew 26. Peter answered and said to him, even though all may fall away. So Jesus has said the sheep will be scattered. Peter says, and we're not surprised, he's voicing his conviction that such would never happen. He says, I'll never fall away. And Jesus said, truly I say to you, this very night before the cock crows, you shall deny me 3 times. And Peter said, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same thing. So Peter verbalized it, as well as all the disciples. I'll never do this. And he denies Jesus 3 times, as we're going to read in another class, Lord willing. And then after Jesus is raised, when he meets them in Galilee, think about this, brothers and sisters. How many times does Jesus give him the opportunity to say, I love you? How many times? 3 times. So he denies Jesus 3 times. And Jesus asked him on that occasion, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, I love you. And then Jesus says, tend my sheep, shepherd my lambs. So before all the other disciples that are there, and I think there were 7 there on that occasion, before all the other disciples are there, he's letting them know he has forgiven Peter. Peter's reaffirming his commitment, and Jesus is reaffirming his love and mercy to Peter. I still have a commission for you to carry out, and you need to carry it out. You need to put that behind you. I've put it behind me. You need to move forward. Shepherd my sheep. You need to tend my lambs. So I think there is a connection between those 2 occasions there. In verse 36, Matthew 26 and verse 36, Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane. Literally, it means oil press. Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And so Jesus spends his last moments of freedom in prayer. Jesus' prayer was an essential part of everything. He knew he couldn't get through the day without prayer. What does that say of ourselves? Should say the same. Well, he took with him Peter, James, and John, as he sometimes did. He said, go with me a little further. He says, and he began to be grieved and distressed. And then he bears his soul. In verse 38, he says, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here. Keep watch with me. Jesus is overwhelmed with sorrow. His heart is breaking. And he says, I need your company. At a time he needed them the most. In verse 39, he went a little beyond them, and he fell on his face, and he prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but thou wilt. Jesus is facing a death so horrible. He asked if there is another way to redeem man from his sin, that God would grant it. But he also says each time, not my will, yours be done.
You think that, part of Jesus, not that he was going to die, no one has to die. I don't think anybody really looks forward to this excruciating thing.
Sure.
No. Death on the cross is not a pleasant experience. Right. Pretty personal. Suffocated. Got low blood pressure, got blood out. You become down. Part of it. Not sacrifice.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it began with the Persians, crucifixion, and then the Greeks perfected it a little more, how to be the most cruel they could possibly be and make a man suffer as much as he possibly can. And then the Romans perfected it even more as far as the pain aspect is concerned. It was unimaginable cruelty and pain and suffering. And if anybody knew about it, Jesus knew every aspect of it. I mean, he's the creator. He'd seen this many times, many times. Even in heaven, he would know about what man had done to be cruel to his fellow man. So I don't think there's any question thinking about the pain and the suffering. Yeah.
Even then, you get that big cross. Last thing that I
Yeah. Always thinking of others. Always thinking of others. The salvation of that man beside him who had been a thief, one of the greatest examples of grace and mercy in all the Bible. That's the way we need to present it. Yes.
Sin was something that he was going to get all our sins. That would be excruciating. He knows he's going to be crucified, but that's for a moment. Compared to having all those sins put on.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for that, sister. He bore our griefs. Isaiah 53 comes to mind all the way through here. He bore our griefs, our sorrows, and our sins. Isaiah prophesied 700 years earlier. Hold on to whatever thoughts you've got. Bring them next week. Let's talk about this a little more, and look forward to studying with you. Thank you for studying the Bible with me tonight.